It's a huge honor to be invited to give the 25th Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture. And it's a great pleasure to be here to help celebrate the 40th anniversary of this wonderful institution, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Governor, you have done a magnificent job in leading this from your successors, and it's wonderful to see them represented here as well, the previous generations of leaders of this great institution. This is a time of extraordinary change, and as we think about the challenges facing the world, we can take inspiration from Sir Arthur Lewis, a humble person from this region who became a giant. He became a giant in the realm of ideas, but much more than ideas. He was an inspiration in terms of how one transforms ideas into action, into policy. And I feel very humbled by being able to talk about some of his legacy, but also to have been able to take advantage of the role model he presented. He was a path breaker in many, many ways. Of course, we know that he was the first black lecturer, he was the first black student at the London School of Economics, and the first recognized professor of color in Britain. Extraordinary breakthroughs in terms of what he was able to achieve at a very young age. More than that, his breakthroughs intellectually, recognized in the Nobel Prize, recognized in his positions at Princeton and elsewhere, speak to his path-breaking ability to think in fresh ways, and more than that, to act in fresh ways. Advisor to the freshly independent government of Ghana, many other governments, and of course, the first president of the Caribbean Development Bank. I had the privilege of being the president of the Southern African Development Bank. And what I found in the inspiration of Arthur Lewis, who I first encountered in my studies in my first year of economics, and as you can see, that was a very long time ago. What I learned from him was not only the ideas about development, but also, as I followed his career, the ability to translate this into real action. And so as I thought about my career, he was an inspiration to me, and he was a primary reason, together that of President Mandela asking me to take on the helm of the Development Bank of Southern Africa and be an economic advisor, as he had been. The questions he posed are questions which are fundamental today as they were then. Why are some countries rich and why are some countries poor? Why are some people rich and some people poor? What is it in the toolbox of ideas that we have that can help us explain these most profound questions? He wanted a world free of poverty. He wanted a world in which people would be seen and be able to realize their capabilities. A world where everyone could realize their potential. And the ideas he developed from a very young age were all about that. He was not alone in this, but what was different about him was that he thought about it in a context of development, not of rich countries. Coming from this region and taking with him in his brain the need to satisfy that question. That question, of course, has not been resolved. We see in the world today still enormous inequalities between countries and between people. The questions he posed are as alive today as they were when he asked them and when he passed away in the early 90s. Many people have taken inspiration from him, sought to build on him. Of course, you can't be an academic with people not also engaging with you, challenging you, and he welcomed that. He found it, at times, rather humorous, the extent to which his ideas were challenged. But he welcomed it, and that's the nature of academic discourse. Always trying to improve, always trying to have better ideas. It's wonderful to see so many scholars here this evening who are at that stage of scholarly pursuit, which is so vital. And as we think forward to the period since he wrote, we have to ask ourselves the question, have things improved? Have we followed his advice? What influence has he had on the world of economics, on leaders around the world? And whereas his ideas were built on the notion that there would be a convergence, that poor countries would develop, that they would catch up with the rich countries, what we've seen, in fact, is huge divergence. Some countries have. But the Ghana he advised in the late 50s, at that time, was richer than Korea. Today, South Korea is 15 times richer than Ghana. And so the questions remain as pertinent and as challenging as they were then. I've been thinking about him a lot in recent years as well, in the context of what would he make of artificial intelligence, and how would he interpret what I see as a coming mass unemployment of people and addressing that as a result of these technological revolutions that are happening at the moment, which will replace many jobs, repetitive jobs, rules-based jobs, jobs that don't require dexterity or empathy. That's what machines, artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, 3D printing excel at. And that creates, particularly for those countries that are still poor with very large and growing labor forces, a situation which is not dissimilar to the situation that he encountered in the early 1950s, of mass of people looking for work, for meaningful work. And that was the basis on which he built the foundations of his work. Now, the subject of tonight's talk is deglobalization and its impact and implications for developing countries, for emerging markets, and particularly for small island developing states. So let me reflect on that, still drawing on some of the ideas, I believe, that were at the heart of what Sir Arthur was writing about. Just about at the time when he passed away in the early 90s, the world experienced a tidal wave of globalization. A number of forces coming together which changed the nature of the world in permanent and fundamental ways. These included the end of the Soviet Union, the coming down of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Now, the young people that are in the room and watching this might not remember those events. I was living in Paris at that time. I'm a South African, I was born in South Africa, and I was in exile because I'd been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. I wasn't able to go back. And when the Berlin Wall came back down, I was working at the OECD, which is an organization, which is an economic think tank. I thought it was amazing, but I thought it was about Eastern Europe. And we started to work on Eastern Europe and the consequences of the end of the Cold War. Little did I appreciate that within 2 months, Nelson Mandela would be released from the prisons where he'd spent 27 years of his life, that he would come to Paris soon after, we would have dinner, he would ask me to go back when he became president to be his economic advisor and to run the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and that South Africa would be free, that I would be able to go back to the country of my birth. I didn't understand that these events that happened in Eastern Europe had a ripple effect around the world. In fact, over 60 countries became democratic within 10 years of the Berlin Wall coming down and the end of the Soviet Union. This was a fundamental element in a new phase of globalization, of connectivity, the integration of the world in ways that were simply not possible in that terrible period of the Cold War. But other things were happening too. China was opening up in dramatic new ways. Europe was uniting with the Maastricht Treaty, 27 countries removing their borders and controls between them to people movement, to capital movement, to goods and services moving between them. NAFTA in the Americas was integrating Canada, the US, and Mexico. The Uruguay round of trade negotiations was dramatically lowering trade barriers around the world. Capital account liberalization imposed by the international institutions was opening up capital markets. And of course, the development of the World Wide Web in 1990, creating an ideas space with the World Wide Web, which was totally different to everything that had gone before. And so, in this, flows across national borders increased in dramatic new ways. This dramatic increase in the flows across national borders led to this tidal wave of globalization. Now, globalization is a much abused word. Everyone has their own notion of what it means. For me, it means flows across national borders, whatever the flows are. Flows of trade, of things, flows of ideas, flows of investment, flows of digital on the World Wide Web, good and bad. And what we've seen in this period since 1990 is a remarkable change in the world, which has integrated in ways which were simply impossible before then. This has been the best thing that has ever happened in the history of humanity. More people have escaped poverty more quickly than at any time in history. And remarkable changes, not least the changes that have democratized South Africa and ended apartheid, occurred in many, many places. Military dictatorships across Latin America and Africa and Eastern Europe fell. We've seen more people lifted out of poverty more quickly than ever in history. Life expectancy has improved more quickly than ever in history. Incomes have grown more quickly than ever in history. The spread of technologies like vaccinations, like technologies which enable you to lead longer, healthier lives. The spread of ideas of women's rights, of gender equality. These are all aspects of globalization. So if globalization is so great, why do so many people dislike it? And the answer is because while globalization has been the most positive thing that's happened, it is also terrifyingly dangerous. It is good, bad, and ugly. There are many bad sides of globalization, and those include what I call the butterfly defect of globalization. Some of you might be aware of the physicist Lorentz's observation that when a butterfly flaps its wings over the Amazon, it can cause a tornado over Texas. The idea of complex dynamic systems, entangled systems. And what globalization has done is entangled us in new ways. Everyone in the world now is now connected. What happens on the other side of the world touches us, and what we do touches them. Whether it's in the choice of fuel we use and our carbon footprint, whether it's what we put on social media, whether it's what we consume in the clothes we wear, or the cars we buy, or the products we use, or what we produce and export, we are entangled in new ways. We're in a complex dynamic system. And because globalization has been so successful at increasing people's incomes, people are consuming more and more. More people have escaped energy poverty. More people have more things, and they come from more places. And that is entangling us. And of course, in this process, as more and more people are leading longer lives, we've seen the world's population grow by about 2 billion over this period of time. More people, more consumption, more entanglement. Now, if you believe in the random distribution of exceptional talent, which I do, there's a lot more geniuses out there, a lot more exceptional people. The Einsteins, the Arthur Lewises, the Shakespeares, the Mozarts, the people who change our ideas, there are more of them in the world, emerging from the new streets of the Caribbean, Soweto, Shanghai, Sao Paulo, and elsewhere. But it's not individuals only that change the world. It's people sparking off each other. It's people learning from each other in teams, in laboratories, in classrooms, in banks like the ECCB. And that is happening at a much bigger scale. And that's why the pace of change is increasing and innovation and technological change is increasing. Invention. That's why we could create a vaccine to address COVID in 9 months, whereas previously it took 10 years. That's why I'm optimistic that we will, out of this new generation of technology, have new cures for cancer. And I worry about things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and dementia and hope they come soon. That's the good news. But the same process also creates some very bad ideas that spread as well. And not just bad ideas, bad surprises. It's wonderful that 1.5 billion more people have energy for the first time over the last 30 years. But what that means is that climate change has accelerated dramatically and created a very, very, very difficult problem. Because we know the rich countries have caused the problem. They've pushed most of the fossil fuel and greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. But we also know now that the solution's got to come from mainly developing countries, because they are now putting more and more up, much more than the rich countries. China's emissions are double those of the US now, for example. A very complicated ethical, political, economic, and development challenge, but caused out of a good aspect of globalization, which is allowing people to have air conditioning, lights, power, computers, etc. There are many other good things that lead to bad things. It's wonderful that over 1 billion people in the world now have access for the first time to antibiotics, antimicrobials. But because so many people are using these drugs, resistance to them is growing, and it could well be that none of them will be effective in the coming years because of this drug resistance that's developing. So one problem of globalization is that success can lead to failure, as we see in climate change, as we see in drug resistance. We have to remove our ideas about being individuals that make choices independently to understanding that whatever we do has a collective global impact. Another challenge associated with globalization is that this entanglement, this increased flow of virtually everything across borders, is totally disconnected from politics. The political system we have is stuck in a Westphalian, pre-Second World War to a large extent, or immediate post-Second World War structure. And so while everything that we do impacts on others increasingly, the political system is increasingly unfit for 21st century purpose. The things that will touch our lives will come from elsewhere. The things that will dramatically change our future prospects are likely to happen somewhere else, but we have no control over them. And that disconnect, which is widening by the minute, between what we can control and what's going to shape our future, and our inability to manage at the global level, is at the heart of many of the problems of deglobalization. What we've seen is the abysmal failure of the global governance system to address 21st century challenges. It is unfit for purpose. I love the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations, we the people, is something I subscribe to, but I wouldn't want to rely on it to solve my problems. If I was in Gaza today, in Ukraine today, or to stop urgently enough the challenges that all countries, but particularly small island development states, will face with climate change. It is operating at best at evolutionary speed when the problems are much more dramatic. This is true also of the international financial system, the World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions, which are basically supertankers that were built after the Second World War that don't reflect the new power politics of the world or the new needs of the world. And changing them is very, very, very difficult for all sorts of reasons. So we're stuck with a governance system which is essentially national and an integrated, complex, dynamic world. The first great manifestation of the underbelly of globalization, for me, was the global financial crisis of 2008-9. And what was particularly disturbing about it is it happened in the best of the global systems. Finance, central banking, finance ministries are the most sophisticated and well-capacitated of global systems. They have the best people, they pay reasonably, they attract the best talent, they're very joined up. The big central bankers play golf once a year, Jackson Hole together. They have each other's mobile phone numbers. This is a joined-up system of technocrats with a very simple mission: financial stability. I was head of policy at the World Bank and vice president of the World Bank in the run-up to the financial crisis. None of us saw it coming. 10,000 PhDs from around the world in economics didn't see it coming. And of course, the audit committees and CEOs and auditors of the private banks didn't see it coming either. They didn't understand this complex dynamic system. They didn't understand the technologies, particularly credit derivatives, which were being played with by young people while the older people who didn't understand them were in charge. The collapse of the global financial system in 2008-9, to me, is at the heart of the problem of deglobalization that we have today. It is the reason people don't trust those that run the show. They don't trust the metropolitan elites. They don't trust the global institutions. They don't trust their politicians. The second big manifestation of the failure of global systems was, of course, the pandemic. Something starting in Wuhan touches us all. It was another reflection of total failure of global governance. All experts who work on public health knew a pandemic was almost inevitable. I've written 3 books trying to ring the alarm about it. Not because I'm a public health expert, but because I speak to them a lot and I'm trying to understand systemic risk. The World Health Organization, one of those organizations, and I don't beat up on the organizations because they do the best they can. I beat up on the shareholders of those organizations. They're the ones that decide how much resource they have, how much power they have, and whether they can be effective or not. And the shareholders, of course, are particularly the big countries, the US, China, India, Europe. These are the people that decide the effectiveness or otherwise of global institutions. And they decided with the World Health Organization they would be unfit for purpose, not reformed, to meet the challenges of new pandemics. And so when the pandemic happened, we were all not surprised. And unfortunately, there will be another one. Because this integrated system, where you have more and more people next to more and more animals in more crowded places, in unsanitary conditions, near airports or train stations, that's how you create a global pandemic. That is the cooking place of a pandemic. People, animals, unsanitary conditions, airports. You add them up, you increase the probability of a pandemic. We know that. One day of what the rich countries found, which is $22 trillion, that's about a quarter of the global economy, was found in remedial action by the rich countries, would stop pandemics in the future by creating a surveillance system capacity for rapid rollout of pandemic responses. But we're not doing it. So when people say they don't like globalization, we need to empathize with them. We need to understand why they say that. Because it's brought a lot of risk. It's brought a lot of harm. A lot of people have lost loved ones because of this integrated system. And there's a third problem. I mentioned financial, I mentioned the pandemic, which is rising inequality within countries and between countries, which is also at the heart of people's anger. And crises increase inequality because poor people don't have savings, poor people don't have resources to move away, to have insurance, to have another option. Poor people are always the most vulnerable. They're the first to lose their jobs. They're the first to starve. And this is true of climate, and this is true of pandemics, and this is true of other great risks, the financial crisis. It exacerbates inequality. The combination of rising inequality and rising risk, and the failure of the people in charge to stop it and manage it, is, I believe, at the heart of the anger against globalization. And this has enormous political consequences. I do not believe that we would have had Brexit in Britain if it had not been for the financial crisis. The growing divide between Londoners and the people doing relatively well in professional services and the rest of the country, and the anger that no bankers went to jail and no one was responsible, was behind the loss of trust in the mainstream political institutions in Europe. The rise of extremist parties across Europe was a direct consequence of the Euro crisis in 2010. And of course, I do not believe that we would have had President Trump in the White House had it not been for the financial crisis. These crises have real consequences. They make people angry, and understandably so. Unfortunately, the response will make the problem worse. Deglobalization is not the answer. Deglobalization can only bring us more poverty and more crises. And the reason is that there's no wall high enough that will keep out the great challenges we face. There's no wall high enough that's going to protect you from climate change. There's no wall high enough, as China found after trying to isolate itself, that's going to stop you from being touched by a pandemic. There's no wall high enough that's going to give you an island of prosperity in a sea of desperation. But what high walls do is they keep out the technologies you need, the vaccinations, for example, or the clean energy. They keep out the investment. They keep out the products you need, like vaccinations. They keep out the ideas you need of how to build a resilient society. And most of all, they keep out the will to cooperate that we so urgently need. More nationalism and more protectionism will slow the world economy, and it will lead to more conflict because countries will cooperate less. The thing that worries me most at the moment is rising tensions between the US and China, because there's no global problem that will not require those two actors, along with some others, but those two actors to be in the room. Whether it's stopping the next pandemic, stopping the next financial crisis, slowing climate change, or whatever it is, those two need to be in the room. And if for the US, deglobalization means less global cooperation, that is a very, very troubling feature. When we think about this landscape, I am not suggesting that every country in the world has the same responsibility and role to play. I am suggesting that key players are extremely important. And they're not always governments, and they're not always, they can be the private sector, they can be cities, they can be others. Paradoxically, as the world has accelerated and become more integrated, place has become more important. Some of you might have read the books of the early period of globalization, like Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, or Francis Cairncross' book, The Death of Distance, which suggested that the development of the World Wide Web and globalization would spread opportunity everywhere. Those are what those titles were about. In fact, what we've seen is the concentration of wealth in fewer places and particularly in dynamic cities. And this will accelerate with artificial intelligence and the new knowledge economy, because the things that used to determine the success of cities, like being near a mine or being near a cotton ginnery and water and all of that, the Industrial Revolution and beyond, is now irrelevant. Now it's, can you attract the best talent? Can you attract investors? Can you attract people to your city or your island? As we think about all these issues, my own view is that deglobalization might be the wrong word. It's rather a rapid transformation of globalization. In fact, if you look at the actual flows, they increasingly are regionalization, and the transformation of many global flows. This is not an unnatural process as countries get richer. The European Union, for example, has 70–80% of flows within the European Union. Asia was 40% in 1990. It's now growing to about 70% of flows within the region. And of course, in the Americas, we will see a similar sort of phenomena, including the Caribbean. Does this matter? It matters if it's behind a wall of nationalism and protectionism. If it's happening naturally, I don't think it is that significant. And we should expect trade as a share of global GDP to decline over time. Because as people get richer, they don't consume more and more and more things. They consume more and more services and increasingly intangible and psychological services. You don't buy more and more fridges and more cars and more shoes, or most people don't. You buy better quality, the intellectual property in them, the design in them. That's what you're interested in. The label, the logo, what it says about you. In fact, you might even consume less. You start believing in diets as you get richer. In that world, as people get richer, we should expect trade of physical products to become a smaller share of global GDP. But what we should also expect more and more what economists call non-tradables, the services that you have to consume by being where you are. We go from a world of manufacturing to massages. The quality of the food. You want a gym, you want to use it. That sort of experience. You can't do this remotely. You can't exercise remotely. You can't eat a good meal remotely. You can't have a massage remotely. It needs to be where you are. And these non-tradables become a bigger share of our spending as we get wealthier. So we shouldn't look at the trade numbers and say deglobalization. In many ways, we can look at them and say that's the success of globalization. But when we see trade frictions leading to lower trade, we should worry. Now, China, of course, is a very sophisticated economy. And so it's benefiting in some respects from this. It's one of the biggest investors in Mexico, for example, at the moment. Asia, increasingly the global center of economic gravity. And, of course, of population. China, 1.4 billion. India, 1.4 billion. Africa, the biggest question. The questions Arthur Lewis asked about Africa remain as pertinent today. And the reason is because whereas virtually everywhere else in the world population is stabilizing, fertility is declining, it's below replacement level in most other countries in the world, African countries are still very young populations with very high fertility rates. Not all of them, but many of them. And that means there's a rapidly growing workforce. Over 10 million people a year in Africa need jobs. And the labor market can only create 3 million a year. That disconnect is going to get worse with artificial intelligence. Because the lower rungs and middle rungs of the development ladder that allowed Asia to develop, which is repetitive tasks in manufacturing, in services like call centers, like back offices in Bangalore, that's gone. And so a big question is, where are the jobs of the future, which are low-skilled or semi-skilled in the international supply chains? And the answer is they're unlikely to be there because this will be automated and robotized. Now, what does this all mean for the SIDS and for the Caribbean, for these wonderful islands of St. Kitts and Nevis and the other members of the ECCB? My own view is that there are some particularly difficult challenges, but there are also some great opportunities on this. The challenges are that, of course, by definition, small island states are very very small in the global play, in population, in the capacity to play, in terms of the number of people. You know, when trade negotiations happen at the World Trade Organization, they typically, the US will send 100 delegates with teams of lawyers, and small island states might have one person. It's an unfair game in that. And the same is true in climate, the same is true in others. These countries are extremely vulnerable because they're small, open, narrow economies typically. They rely on a small number of goods and services. Tourism is very significant. Investment is very significant. And as you saw in the pandemic, this can be very rapidly turned off. They are also extremely vulnerable to shocks of all types. Economic shocks, war in Ukraine, because they import a lot as a share of their economy. Oil price shocks, food price shocks really matter more than to most other countries in terms of the impact. So the vulnerability index of small island states is much higher than for equivalent income other states. In the case of low-income small island states, it tends to be a third to a half higher in terms of vulnerability indices. And for the richer small island states, it's about 75%, three-quarters higher than for equivalent income of other states. Very vulnerable. And for some countries, climate change is an existential risk. In fact, of the countries that are unlikely to exist in 2100, they're all small island states. An existential threat for some countries, like the Maldives and like some others. This vulnerability is being compounded by the fact that the big players increasingly are setting rules which are very expensive to comply with. The costs of compliance of new regulations on money laundering, on counterpart banking, on many other areas are very high. And if you don't have the capacity, you have a real problem, which is why the role of the ECCB is going to become more and more important. Having that skill on behalf of a group of countries to play in that and negotiate with that and convince your counterparts that you're doing what's necessary on, for example, the transparency around money laundering, etc. Governance and the rules become more and more important. But compliance is going to increase, and so too will the needs of technical expertise. But in a world of artificial intelligence, unique experiences and creativity will count for more and more. And your small population sizes and your ability to give people a unique experience based on what you are, based particularly in the Caribbean on your absolutely incredible experience that people have, which is different, in my view, is going to be a huge source of future generation of incomes and of prosperity. Remember that there are 2 billion more middle-class people in the world over the last 30 years since globalization started, and the growth of this new middle class is enormous. By that I mean people who have discretionary income, who can have some tourism and travel, who can go places, who can learn about places. I see the prospects for unique experiences, for tourism, for travel, as growing extremely rapidly. And increasingly, this will not be from this region, but from Asia and different parts of Asia, not least China. What you experience here, you cannot experience in northern countries that are very cold and wet, as I know, having left Oxford to come here. That will not go away. The music, the culture, the unique experience is very, very special and needs to be harvested even more effectively globally. Now, can one survive out of that? Not only. One needs a diversified economy. But there are many other avenues for diversification as well, for employment creation. Most important is to keep your talent here. Because you have such a small talent pool relative to the rest of the world, trying to retain, attract, bring back talent is important. And that means giving people the amenities and the prospects that they want in life. But it also means attracting talented people from elsewhere. In a world of nomads who can work anywhere, how many will want to be on small islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere? And I suggest many. High income, ability to pay, ability to create other jobs. For every high-income job, there's something like 3 to 5 other jobs created. And of course, those need to be decently paid, and those need to give people prospects of the future. So we live in a very turbulent world. This will be the slowest evening you know for the rest of your lives. The pace of change is accelerating because there are more and more actors in the world with more ideas doing more things. And it connects and entangles us. And in that world, constantly learning and thinking is at the heart of the secret of success, because old ideas become outdated more quickly. But there are some things that don't change. Ethics, values, who you are as individuals, as a people, your value systems, where you are, and what that offers. And I believe that will be the strength going into the future. It will be the rock that you anchored on. And I believe, because I've experienced this firsthand in the time I've been here with the ECCB, that it will provide the guidance on monetary policy that you need in this particular region, under Governor Timothy Antoine's extraordinary able guidance to navigate this very stormy period ahead. Thank you very much.